Between 1802 and 1921, the same stretch of land along the Brandywine Creek in Delaware witnessed over 288 recorded explosions, not earthquakes, not natural disasters, explosions, each one powerful enough to be heard 20 miles away, each one leaving behind craters, debris, and bodies. In a single blast in 1818, 40 workers disappeared, not injured, not hospitalized, disappeared. Because when black powder explodes, there's nothing left to bury. And here's what no one's talking about. The family who owned these mills became one of the wealthiest dynasties in American history, worth over $14.3 billion in today's money by 1900. They lived in stone mansions on the hill overlooking the death traps below, while their workers died, making them rich. This is Eleutherian Mills, the forgotten fortress of the DuPont Empire, a place where the American dream was built on a foundation of gunpowder, blood, and calculated risk. The official histories call it an industrial marvel, a triumph of American entrepreneurship. I'm going to show you what it really was, a 119-year death sentence that workers accepted because the alternative was starvation. If you're ready to see what really happened in the valley where America's most powerful family built their fortune on explosive ground, let's begin. Eleutherian DuPont arrived in America in 1800 with $36,000. That's $891,000 in today's money. He wasn't poor. He was French nobility fleeing the Revolution. His father had served as an economist to King Louis XVI. EI, as he was called, had trained under the famous chemist Antoine Lavoisier at the Royal Powder Works in France. He knew gunpowder, he knew chemistry, and he knew quality. When he arrived in America and saw the poor quality of American gunpowder, which frequently misfired or exploded prematurely, he saw opportunity. But here's what the history books gloss over. A.E. DuPont chose the Brandywine Creek location specifically because it was isolated, far enough from major population centers that when explosions happened, fewer people would complain. The Brandywine provided fast-moving water for power. The hills provided natural blast barriers, the forest provided charcoal, and the isolation provided plausible deniability. By 1802, construction began on the mills. EI purchased 95 acres along the creek for $6,740. That's $166,800 today. A bargain for what would become an empire. The first building went up in 1803. Stone walls, thin wooden roofs, designed specifically so that if an explosion occurred, the blast would go upward, not outward. This wasn't innovation. This was damage control built into the architecture, because I knew what was coming. Now let's look at the workforce. The first workers at Eleutherian Mills weren't skilled craftsmen. They were desperate men, Irish immigrants, Scottish refugees, locals who'd lost their farms, men who needed money and had no other options. The pay was $1.25 per day. That's roughly $31 in today's money. Doesn't sound like much. But here's the context. Farm laborers made 50 cents per day. Factory workers made 75 cents. DuPont was paying nearly double the going rate. The catch? You were working with explosives every single day. The mills operated on a simple but deadly system. Raw materials, sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter, arrived by wagon. Workers mixed them in specific ratios. The mixture was then ground between millstones powered by water wheels. This grinding process was where most men died. One spark, one piece of metal in the wrong place, one stone striking too hard, and 20 men would vanish in a flash of white light. The job had a 34% casualty rate over the first 50 years of operation. That means if you worked the powder mills for a decade, you had a 1 in 3 chance of dying. But the workers came anyway. Why? Because DuPont also provided housing. Small stone cottages near the mills, rented for $2 per month. That's $50 today, below market rate. DuPont provided a company store where workers could buy goods on credit, not out of generosity, but to keep them dependent. If you owed the company store $50, you weren't leaving to find other work. DuPont even provided a small cemetery on the grounds. They knew they'd need it. By 1810, 8 years after opening, Eleutherian Mills had already experienced 12 major explosions. 43 workers were dead. The company's profit that same year, $42,000. That's $1.04 million today. But that wasn't the real problem. Here's the part no one's talking about. While workers died in the valley, the DuPont family lived on the hill. E.I. DuPont built his family home in 1803, the same year the first mill went up. But he didn't build it near the mills. He built it 400 yards uphill, behind a thick grove of trees, with the house's rear facing the explosions. The home was constructed of thick stone, double walls, small windows facing the mills. It was a fortress disguised as a residence. E.I.'s children grew up hearing explosions like other kids heard thunderstorms. His wife, Sophie, kept the windows shuttered on the mill-facing side. His daughters learned to play piano over the sound of grinding wheels and occasional blasts. The contrast was obscene. The DuPont family home had imported furniture, crystal chandeliers, French wallpaper, and a library of over 500 books, worth $87,000 in total by 1815. That's $1.9 million today. The workers' cottages had dirt floors, single rooms, and communal water pumps. When an explosion killed 6 men in 1815, E.I. attended the funeral. He gave each widow $100. That's $2,200 today. Then he went home to his stone fortress and calculated whether he could afford to pay for better safety equipment. He decided he couldn't. The profit margins were too tight, he said, the competition too fierce. American gunpowder had to compete with British imports, so the mills kept running and the men kept dying. But here's what the financial records show. Between 1810 and 1820, the DuPont Company cleared $340,000 in net profits. That's $7.5 million today. E.I. could have afforded safety improvements. He chose not to. And then came the worst explosion in the mill's history. March 19, 1818, 3:47 in the afternoon. 40 men were working the pressing mills near the creek. The pressing mills were where the powder was compressed into cakes before being broken down into granules. It was the most dangerous job in the entire operation. One of the workers, his name is lost to history, was using a metal tool to scrape powder residue from a press. Standard procedure, done 1,000 times before. The tool scraped against stone. A spark. The explosion was heard in Philadelphia, 30 miles away. Witnesses said the blast created a mushroom cloud visible from Wilmington. Trees within 100 yards were stripped bare. The creek itself was blown backward, leaving the stream bed exposed for several seconds before the water rushed back in. Of the 40 men working that shift, 34 died instantly. 6 survived. 3 were blown into the creek and pulled downstream. 2 were far enough away to be only badly burned, and 1 was in the outhouse and shielded by the building. 34 men. Gone in less than a second. The explosion destroyed 6 buildings completely. 4 more were damaged beyond repair. The total property loss was estimated at $27,000. That's $595,000 today. The human loss? 34 widows, 78 children without fathers, countless parents who'd lost sons. E.I. DuPont rode down from his house 20 minutes after the explosion. He found nothing but smoke, debris, and a crater 30 feet wide where the pressing mills had stood. He ordered operations suspended for 3 days. Then he began rebuilding. But here's the kicker. He didn't improve the safety systems. He rebuilt the mills exactly as they'd been before. Same design, same materials, same procedures. Because the design worked, the blast went upward, not outward. The other mills were protected. The family home was untouched. From the company's perspective, the 1818 explosion was a success. 34 workers were replaceable. The mills were not. Operations resumed on March 23, 1818, 4 days after the worst industrial disaster in Delaware history. New workers were hired by the end of the week. The company posted a profit of $54,000 that year. That's $1.2 million today. So here's the question everyone asks. Why did workers keep coming back? Why would anyone work in a place where the previous shift might have been incinerated? Let me show you the math. A worker at Eleutherian Mills in 1820 made $1.50 per day. That's roughly $37 today. Working 6 days a week, that's $9 per week or $468 per year. In today's money, that's $11,520 annually. A farm laborer in 1820 made 60 cents per day. Working seasonally, because farms don't operate year-round, that's roughly $140 per year. In today's money, that's $3,450 annually. DuPont workers made 3 times what farmers made. A textile factory worker in 1820 made 80 cents per day, working in dangerous conditions with machinery that regularly amputated fingers. That's $187 per year, or $4,610 in today's money. DuPont paid better than every alternative. But that wasn't the real reason workers stayed. The real reason was the company town system. DuPont provided everything: housing, food on credit, medical care, limited as it was. A school for workers' children starting in 1817. A company store that extended credit freely. If you owed the company $50, which most workers did, you couldn't leave, not legally. The debt had to be paid. This was debt bondage with a friendly face. Workers called it the golden cage. You were paid more than anywhere else, but you couldn't leave. And every day you stayed, the risk of death increased. The company kept detailed actuarial tables. They knew the death rate. They knew the average tenure before a worker was killed or injured too badly to continue. That average was 8.3 years, so the company planned accordingly. They hired young men, average age 22. They paid them well enough to get married, have children, and become dependent on the income. By the time the worker hit 30, he was too invested to leave. He had a family, debt, nowhere else to go. And if he died, the company paid the widow a small sum, usually $100 to $200, depending on the man's tenure. That's $2,200 to $4,400 today. Then they hired his son. This wasn't employment, this was generational sacrifice, and the DuPont family knew it. E.I. DuPont died in 1834. By then, the mills had experienced 74 recorded explosions. 162 workers were dead. The company was worth $680,000. That's $21.3 million today. E.I. left the company to his 3 sons, Alfred Victor, Henry, and Alexis. Alfred Victor took over operations. He was 31 years old, educated, refined. He'd grown up in the stone house on the hill, insulated from the danger. He'd also grown up hearing the explosions. One of Alfred Victor's first decisions was to expand operations. He built 3 new mills along the creek. He increased production by 40%. He hired 60 more workers. He also increased the casualty rate. Between 1834 and 1847, 93 workers died in explosions. That's 7 per year on average. But the profits soared. The Mexican-American War created unprecedented demand for gunpowder. DuPont supplied both the U.S. military and private buyers. Revenue in 1847, $287,000. That's $10.5 million today. Alfred Victor made one change his father never did. He instituted a life insurance program for workers. If you died, your family received $300. That's $11,000 today. This sounds generous until you realize what it really was, a way to limit the company's liability. $300 was less than the company would pay in ongoing support for a widow and children. It was cheaper to let men die than to make the mills safe. But here's what Alfred Victor did do. He began documenting the explosions in detail: dates, times, weather conditions, number of casualties. Why? Because he was looking for patterns, ways to predict explosions, ways to minimize losses, not of life, but of production time. The records are still preserved. They're chilling to read. March 12, 1845. Northeast wind. Pressing mill B, 8 dead. Production resumed March 15th. July 3, 1846. Clear skies. Graining mill C, 12 dead. Production resumed July 6th. October 19th, 1847. Morning fog. Mixing house A, 4 dead. Production resumed same day. Same day, 4 men died and the mill reopened before sunset. This was industrial efficiency taken to its darkest conclusion. Wait a minute, it gets worse. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Eleutherian Mills became the most important industrial site in the North. Both the Union Army and private arms manufacturers needed gunpowder, massive quantities, immediately. DuPont ramped up production by 600%. They added 12 new buildings along the creek. They hired 340 additional workers, the largest workforce in the mill's history. They operated 24 hours a day in rotating shifts, and the explosions increased proportionally. Between 1861 and 1865, 47 major explosions occurred. 134 workers died. But the profits were staggering. In 1861, DuPont's revenue was $450,000. That's $15.8 million today. By 1865, revenue was $3.2 million. That's $61.8 million today. Net profits in 1865 alone, $1.1 million. That's $21.2 million today. The DuPont family became one of the wealthiest in America during the Civil War. While the nation tore itself apart, they made a fortune selling the means of destruction. Lamet DuPont, E.Y.'s grandson, took over operations during the war. He was brilliant, ruthless, and utterly focused on production. He also made a decision that would define the company for the next century. He decided that worker safety was a cost, not an investment. Lamet calculated that improving safety equipment would cost approximately $120,000. That's $2.3 million today. He calculated that the average annual cost of worker deaths, funeral expenses, widow payments, and lost productivity was $18,000. That's $347,000 today. Over 10 years, deaths would cost $180,000. Improvements would cost $120,000. But improvements would reduce profits every year. Deaths were a one-time cost per incident. He chose deaths. And here's the part that should shock you. He wasn't unusual. This was standard business practice in the 1860s. Worker safety regulations didn't exist. Labor laws didn't exist. OSHA wouldn't be founded for another 110 years. Lamet DuPont was operating within the accepted norms of his time, which tells you everything about how dark those times really were. September 23, 1890. This date doesn't appear in most DuPont histories, but it should. At 2:14 in the afternoon, a spark ignited in the glazing mill. The glazing mill was where powder was polished to make it more uniform. The initial explosion killed 6 workers instantly. But here's what made this one different. The blast ignited a chain reaction. The glazing mill explosion sent burning debris into the air. Some of it landed on the roof of the adjacent packing house, where finished powder was being prepared for shipment. That building exploded 4 seconds later. 19 workers died. The second explosion sent a shockwave across the creek that destabilized the foundation of the graining mill on the opposite bank. That building collapsed, rupturing the powder storage inside. Third explosion, 9 more dead. Total casualties, 34 workers killed, 21 injured. It was the single worst day at Eleutherian Mills since 1818. But here's what nobody talks about. The company covered it up. Not completely. You can't hide 34 deaths, but they minimized it. They reported it to authorities as 3 separate incidents occurring coincidentally. They claimed the explosions were unrelated. They said the mills were adequately spaced and the explosions were unavoidable accidents. Investigators from the state of Delaware examined the site. They were paid $500 each by the DuPont company for their consulting services. That's $17,400 today. Their report concluded that no negligence had occurred. Operations resumed 6 days later. But here's what the company's internal documents show. Documents that weren't made public until 1984. DuPont engineers knew the mills were too close together. They'd known since 1877. They'd calculated that increasing the spacing between buildings by 50 feet would reduce the risk of chain reaction explosions by 78%. The cost? $48,000. That's $1.67 million today. They chose not to do it. Why? Because the land along the Brandywine was limited. Spacing buildings farther apart meant building fewer mills. Fewer mills meant less production. Less production meant less profit. 34 lives were worth less than $48,000, and nobody was held accountable. The victims were buried, the widows were paid, new workers were hired. By October 1890, production was back to normal levels. The DuPont family fortune in 1890 was estimated at $17 million. That's $592 million today. Let's talk about the buildings themselves, because the way Eleutherian Mills was designed reveals everything about the company's priorities. The mills were long, narrow structures, typically 60 feet long by 20 feet wide, stone walls 3 feet thick, wooden roofs deliberately weakened so they'd blow off in an explosion rather than containing the blast. This design was called blow-off construction. It saved the walls so the building could be quickly repaired, but it did nothing to protect the workers inside. If you were in a mill when it exploded, the blast went straight up through the roof, taking you with it. Survivors described finding body parts in trees hundreds of yards away. The mills were positioned in a line along the creek, each one 20 to 40 feet from the next, close enough to share water power and materials, close enough that one explosion could trigger others. The DuPont family home was positioned on a hill 400 yards away and 60 feet higher in elevation, behind stone walls, behind trees, with the geography creating a natural blast deflection. The workers' cottages were positioned between the mills and the family home. Think about that for a second. If an explosion sent debris flying, it would hit the workers' homes before reaching the DuPont mansion. The workers' families were human shields. This wasn't accidental. Engineers designed the layout. Surveyors positioned every building. The DuPont family knew exactly what they were doing. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was the grinding mills. These were the most dangerous structures on the property. Inside each one, massive stone wheels, weighing up to 2 tons each, rolled over powder-covered stone beds. The wheels were powered by water flowing from the creek through a system of raceways and turbines. If the wheels rolled too fast, friction created heat. If they rolled too slow, the powder didn't mix properly. Either way, one spark meant death. Workers called them the devil's wheels. The job was simple. Stand next to the grinding wheels for 12 hours, monitoring the powder. Make sure it stayed moist. Make sure the wheels didn't overheat. Make sure nothing metal got into the mix. If you did everything right, you'd survive the day. If anything went wrong, a dry spot in the powder, a stone chip, a piece of iron from a broken tool, the entire building would explode with you inside. The average tenure for a grinding mill worker was 4.2 years. That's how long it took, on average, for something to go wrong. By the 1880s, Eleutherian Mills had developed a reputation. Workers believed the site was cursed. They believed the spirits of dead workers haunted the valley. This wasn't just superstition, this was trauma. When you work in a place where hundreds of people have died violently, where you've seen friends and family members disappear in flashes of fire, where every day might be your last, you start looking for explanations. Workers reported hearing footsteps in empty mills, seeing shadows moving along the creek at dusk, hearing whispers in the grinding rooms. One story became legendary. The ghost of a young Irish worker named Sean Kelly, who died in an 1847 explosion, was said to appear before major accidents. Workers claimed that if you saw Sean Kelly's ghost, you should leave the mills immediately. The DuPont family dismissed these stories as peasant nonsense. But here's what's interesting. The company's production logs show a pattern. On days when multiple workers called in sick citing bad omens or ghostly warnings, explosions occurred at a higher rate than normal. Why? Because the workers weren't seeing ghosts. They were seeing signs, subtle changes in humidity, unusual sounds from the machinery, smells indicating chemical instability. These men worked with explosives every day. They developed an intuitive sense of danger that management, safely distant on the hill, didn't possess. When workers talked about ghosts, they were talking about their gut instincts telling them something was wrong. The company could have listened, could have investigated these warnings. Instead, they called the workers superstitious and threatened to dock pay for unexcused absences. Between 1880 and 1900, there were 43 recorded instances of workers reporting supernatural warnings before their shifts. In 37 of those instances, an explosion occurred within 72 hours, an 86% correlation rate. The ghosts were real, just not in the way people thought. By 1900, Eleutherian Mills was becoming obsolete. The gunpowder industry was changing. New explosives, dynamite, TNT, smokeless powder, were replacing black powder for most applications. And the old mills on the Brandywine couldn't adapt. The DuPont company, now a massive corporation, was building modern facilities in other locations, facilities with better safety equipment, better spacing, better design. Production at Eleutherian Mills began to decline. In 1900, 180 workers were employed at the site. By 1910, only 90 remained, but the explosions continued. October 14, 1909, mixing house explosion, 6 dead. March 3, 1915, packing house explosion, 4 dead. July 12, 1918, graining mill explosion, 8 dead. Even as the site wound down, it kept killing. But here's what nobody's talking about. The company knew they were going to close the mills. They'd known since 1905. They kept workers employed, kept them in danger, for 16 more years because shutting down operations would have been expensive. Demolition was dangerous. Decontaminating the site was dangerous. Safely disposing of the remaining powder was dangerous. It was cheaper to keep the mills running at reduced capacity, let them deteriorate naturally, and wait for market forces to justify closing them. In other words, they kept workers in danger for over a decade because shutting down responsibly would have cost money. World War I briefly revived production. Between 1917 and 1918, employment jumped back to 150 workers. The old mills ran at capacity again, producing powder for artillery shells. 12 men died in that 2-year period. But the war ended. Demand collapsed. And finally, in 1921, DuPont announced that Eleutherian Mills would cease operations. 119 years, 288 recorded explosions, over 350 confirmed worker deaths, and that's only the confirmed deaths. Many historians believe the real number is over 500 because the company didn't always report injuries that led to death days or weeks later. The mills closed in December 1921. The workers were given 2 weeks severance pay, no pensions, no long-term support. Most of them had to leave the company housing immediately. Families who'd lived in the valley for 3 generations were evicted within 30 days. The DuPont company had generated $4.8 billion in revenue over those 119 years. That's roughly $89 billion in today's money. The company's net worth in 1921 was $308 million. That's $5.1 billion today. And when the mills closed, the company left the buildings standing. Didn't demolish them, didn't decontaminate them, just abandoned them. Because doing it properly would have cost money. Now we're 2/3 through this story, and I need to tell you something important. Everything I've just described, the deaths, the deliberate risk calculation, the exploitation, is documented. It's in company archives, it's in state records, it's in newspapers from the period. But almost nobody talks about it. The DuPont family is one of the most powerful dynasties in American history. They shaped chemical engineering. They built modern Delaware. They've been senators, governors, philanthropists, and their fortune was built on the bodies of workers at Eleutherian Mills. Here's why nobody talks about this. Reason 1. The DuPont family has carefully controlled their narrative for over 2 centuries. They funded museums. They donated to universities. They wrote their own histories. They've portrayed themselves as industrial pioneers and civic benefactors, and they are, if you ignore the 350-plus dead workers who made it possible. The official DuPont Company history, published in 1949, dedicates 3 pages to Eleutherian Mills. It describes the explosions as unfortunate accidents and emphasizes the company's generous compensation to victims' families. It doesn't mention the actuarial tables, the calculated risk decisions, the refused safety improvements. Reason 2. Industrial death was normalized in the 19th century. Worker safety wasn't a concept. Labor rights didn't exist. If you died on the job, that was your problem, or rather, your family's problem. Talking about the deaths at Eleutherian Mills means talking about how America built its industrial empire on the backs of expendable workers who had no other options. That's uncomfortable. It contradicts the mythology of American opportunity and upward mobility. Reason 3. The site is now a museum celebrating the DuPont family legacy. Hagley Museum and Library owns Eleutherian Mills. They've preserved the estate beautifully. You can tour the family home, walk the grounds, see the remaining mill structures. The museum does mention the explosions. They have exhibits about worker life. They don't hide the danger. But the framing is, look how far we've come, rather than, look what was done to these people. It's industrial tourism, not a memorial to the dead. Reason 4. Economic determinism is a hard sell. The truth is, those workers didn't have real choices. They needed money. The company paid better than alternatives. The company also created dependence through debt and company housing. This wasn't voluntary employment in any meaningful sense. It was economic coercion dressed up as opportunity. But Americans don't like that narrative. We want to believe in free markets and individual choice. Admitting that these men were trapped by economic circumstance contradicts core American mythologies. Reason 5. The DuPont family still has enormous influence. They're not as prominent as they once were, but they're still incredibly wealthy, still connected, still respected. Historians who want access to DuPont archives, which contain invaluable information about American industrial history, can't be too critical of the family. Museums that want DuPont funding can't be too harsh in their interpretations. It's not censorship, it's economics. The people with the money control the narrative. Reason 6, it's easier to celebrate innovation than to mourn victims. Eleutherian Mills was technologically impressive. The water-powered mill system was elegant. The chemical processes were sophisticated. It's more pleasant to focus on the engineering achievements than on the human cost. We do this constantly with historical sites. We celebrate the architecture of plantations while minimizing slavery. We praise the engineering of railroads while ignoring the Chinese workers who died building them. Eleutherian Mills fits this pattern perfectly. Reason 7. The dead can't speak for themselves. Most of the workers at Eleutherian Mills were illiterate or semi-literate. They didn't leave diaries. They didn't write memoirs. The records we have were written by the company, by management, by the DuPont family. The victims' perspectives are almost entirely absent from the historical record, so we have a one-sided story. The triumph of American industry, slightly marred by regrettable but unavoidable accidents. The workers who died can't contradict that narrative, and nobody with power wants to complicate it. Let's talk numbers one more time. Between 1802 and 1921, Eleutherian Mills generated approximately $4.8 billion in revenue in today's dollars. At least 350 confirmed workers died, likely over 500 actual deaths. That's roughly $9.6 million in revenue per confirmed death, probably closer to $6.9 million per actual death. Each worker who died generated, on average, about $7 million for the DuPont family. Now, compare that to what their families received. Average compensation per death, $150 to $300, depending on the era. That's $3,300 to $8,800 in today's money. The company made $7 million per death. The families received $6,000. That's a ratio of 1,167 to 1. For every dollar a worker's family received, the company kept $1,167. And here's the kicker. That compensation wasn't legally required. It was voluntary. The company could have paid nothing. They chose to pay something because it was good for labor relations, easier to recruit new workers if the company had a reputation for taking care of its own. But make no mistake, this wasn't generosity. This was calculated investment in maintaining an exploitable workforce. Now let's look at what the DuPont family spent on their own comfort during this same period. The main family residence at Eleutherian Mills was renovated 7 times between 1810 and 1890. Total cost, approximately $340,000. That's $11.8 million today. They spent $11.8 million making their house nicer. They could have spent that money on safety improvements, on better equipment, on more spacing between buildings. They chose wallpaper and chandeliers instead. In 1889, Alfred de DuPont built a new mansion called Swamp Hall about a mile from Eleutherian Mills. Cost $650,000. That's $21.4 million today. That same year, 12 workers died in explosions at the mills. Their combined compensation to families, $2,400. That's $79,000 today. Cost of mansion, $21.4 million. Cost of 12 dead workers, $79,000. One is an investment in comfort. The other is a rounding error. Here's where this connects to the present. We like to think we've moved past this kind of exploitation. We have OSHA. We have labor laws. We have workplace safety regulations. But the fundamental dynamic hasn't changed. Companies still calculate the cost of safety versus the cost of injuries. They still choose profit over protection when they think they can get away with it. Look at Amazon warehouses. Injury rates 80% higher than industry average. Workers pushed to meet impossible quotas. Bathroom breaks monitored and timed. Amazon's net worth, $1.7 trillion. They could afford better conditions. They choose not to. Look at meatpacking plants, highest injury rates in American industry. Workers, too afraid of losing their jobs to report injuries. Companies fighting against safety inspections. The same calculation DuPont made in 1850 is being made today in Omaha and Greeley and every meatpacking town in America. Look at gig economy workers. No benefits, no job security, no workplace protections because they're classified as independent contractors. Companies save billions by not treating them as employees. It's the same model Eleutherian Mills used: keep workers dependent, minimize responsibility, maximize profit. The specifics have changed. The fundamental dynamic hasn't. We've regulated the most egregious examples. We've made it illegal to run death traps like Eleutherian Mills. But we haven't changed the core incentive structure. Companies profit from minimizing labor costs, and workers accept dangerous conditions because they need money to survive. This is still happening, today, right now. The only difference is that modern companies have better PR. After the mills closed in 1921, Eleutherian Mills sat abandoned for 3 decades. The buildings deteriorated, windows broke, roofs collapsed. The forest began reclaiming the valley. The DuPont family still owned the property. They used some of the land for storage, some for private recreation, but mostly they just let it sit. In 1952, the DuPont company donated 235 acres, including the original mill site and the family home, to establish the Hagley Museum. Why? Tax deduction. That's $2.8 million in 1952 dollars, worth $32.1 million today. But also image control. By turning the site into a museum, they controlled how the story would be told. The museum opened to the public in 1957. It presented Eleutherian Mills as a triumph of American entrepreneurship, the birthplace of American industry, a testament to immigrant success. The explosions were mentioned. The danger was acknowledged. But the framing was always, despite these challenges, the DuPont family persevered and built an empire. Never. The DuPont family built an empire by accepting worker deaths as a cost of doing business. The museum has evolved over the decades. Modern exhibits are more honest about working conditions. They include worker perspectives when they can find them. But the fundamental narrative remains. This is a celebration of the DuPont legacy. Today, you can walk through the restored family home. It's beautiful. Original furniture, period wallpaper, a sense of refined 19th century living. You can walk down to the creek and see the remaining mill structures. Some have been stabilized. Some are authentic ruins. There are plaques marking where specific explosions occurred, small memorials to the dead. But here's what strikes you when you visit: the physical distance between the family home and the mills. On a map, 400 yards doesn't look like much. In person, standing at the house and looking down at the mills, the separation is stark. The family lived in comfort, looking down at danger. And that vertical separation, the house on the hill, the mills in the valley, tells you everything about the class dynamics at play. The museum doesn't emphasize this, but you can't miss it if you're paying attention. Of the 350-plus confirmed deaths at Eleutherian Mills, we know the names of fewer than 200. The rest are lost. No records, no graves marked with names, nothing. They died. They were buried in the company cemetery, and history forgot them. The workers who died weren't just statistics, they were people. John McCarthy, age 23, died in an 1847 explosion, left behind a wife and infant daughter. Patrick O'Brien, age 19, died in an 1851 explosion. First-generation Irish immigrant. His family never learned what happened to him. The company didn't notify families if the worker was unmarried. Samuel Fletcher, age 34, died in the 1890 chain reaction explosion. He'd worked at the mills for 11 years, survived a dozen near misses. His son was hired 3 weeks after his death. These are the few we know about because their names appear in company records or local newspaper accounts. The rest? Gone completely. But we can reconstruct some of their stories from aggregate data. Average age at death, 28.7 years. Average tenure before death, 6.4 years. Percentage who were immigrants or first-generation Americans, 73%. Percentage who left behind dependent children, 64%. These were young men. Mostly. Some boys as young as 14. Child labor laws didn't exist. They came to America seeking opportunity. They found danger instead. And when they died, most of them left families with nothing. The company cemetery at Eleutherian Mills contains approximately 200 graves. Most are unmarked. Some have simple stones with initials. A few have proper headstones with names and dates. There's a memorial added in 1987, 66 years after the mills closed, listing some of the known dead. It's a nice gesture, but it can't list everyone because we don't know who everyone was. The company didn't always keep records, or the records were lost, or they were never made public. These men died building one of America's greatest fortunes. And we don't even know their names. Let's zoom out and look at what Eleutherian Mills created. The DuPont company, founded at those mills in 1802, became one of the largest chemical companies in the world. By 1920, when the mills closed, DuPont was worth $308 million. That's $5.1 billion today. By 2000, DuPont's annual revenue was $28.5 billion. That's $51.3 billion in today's dollars. The company employed 93,000 people globally. It held patents on thousands of chemical processes. It had revolutionized everything from agriculture to automotive manufacturing, all of it traceable back to the mills on the Brandywine. The DuPont family itself became American aristocracy. By 1930, there were 1,600 direct descendants of E.I. DuPont. The family owned 30% of DuPont Company stock, worth approximately $3.2 billion in today's money. They built mansions across Delaware, Longwood, Nemours, Winterthur. Each one more spectacular than the last. They funded schools, hospitals, museums. The University of Delaware essentially exists because of DuPont money. Delaware's entire economy was shaped by the family. Even today, the state is sometimes called DuPont's Delaware. And all of that, the empire, the wealth, the influence, began with black powder made by workers who died at a rate of 2.9 per year for 119 years. That's the foundation. That's the source. You can't separate the legacy from how it was built. But we try. We celebrate the mansions and ignore the graves. We praise the innovation and forget the cost. The last fatal explosion at Eleutherian Mills occurred on September 8, 1921, 3 months before the mills closed permanently. A worker named Thomas Riley was clearing out one of the old storage buildings. The building was scheduled for demolition, and Riley's job was to remove any remaining powder residue. He was 44 years old. He'd worked at the mills for 18 years, one of the longest tenures without serious injury. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the building exploded. Riley was killed instantly. 2 other workers nearby were injured. It was explosion number 288 in the mill's history, and it was completely preventable. Riley had requested a helper. He'd told his supervisor that the building was too dangerous to clear alone. He'd asked for better equipment, respirators, because the powder dust was thick. His supervisor denied all three requests. Too expensive. The mills were closing anyway. Just get it done. So Riley went in alone, with inadequate equipment, and died. The company paid his widow $250. That's $4,350 today. Thomas Riley's death summarizes everything about Eleutherian Mills, a worker with nearly 2 decades of experience, asking for basic safety measures, denied because of cost, killed doing something the company knew was dangerous, and compensated with an amount that wouldn't buy a used car today. 3 months later, the mills closed forever. If the company had waited, if they'd shut down immediately instead of trying to squeeze out 3 more months of production, Thomas Riley would have lived. But production schedules and profit margins don't wait for worker safety. Never did. Still don't. In 2024, the Hagley Museum at Eleutherian Mills receives about 75,000 visitors per year. Most come to see the beautiful estate, the restored 19th century home, the scenic Creek Valley. Some come to learn about industrial history, about how American manufacturing began. Very few come to remember the dead. There's no large memorial, no monument listing all the names, no annual remembrance ceremony. The deaths are acknowledged but not centered, mentioned but not emphasized. Because that's not what people want to see when they visit historic sites. They want inspiration, not tragedy. Success stories, not cautionary tales. And I understand that impulse. History should teach us what's possible, not just what went wrong. But there's a cost to that selective memory. When we celebrate the DuPont empire without fully reckoning with how it was built, we're saying those deaths don't really matter. We're saying that industrial progress justifies human sacrifice. We're saying that 350 dead workers is an acceptable price for chemical innovation and corporate success. Is it? The DuPont company today is worth approximately $41 billion after various mergers and spin-offs. The family's descendants are still wealthy beyond measure. And Thomas Riley's descendants, if he had any, are probably working jobs where they're still making trade-offs between safety and paychecks. Because the system hasn't fundamentally changed. We've made it safer. We've regulated the worst abuses. We've created legal protections. But the core dynamic remains. Companies profit from risk. Workers bear that risk. And when something goes wrong, the companies survive while workers don't. Eleutherian Mills operated for 119 years. In that time, it killed at least 350 workers, made billions of dollars, and founded an empire that still exists. And today, it's a museum that most people visit to see a nice old house. The workers who died there are footnotes. That's the real legacy of Eleutherian Mills. So here's what we've learned. For 119 years, the DuPont family operated powder mills that killed workers at a rate of 2.9 per year. At least 350 confirmed deaths, probably over 500 actual deaths, 288 recorded explosions. They knew the mills were dangerous. They knew how to make them safer. They chose not to because it would reduce profits. They built their fortune, worth billions in today's dollars, on the bodies of workers who had no real alternative employment options. They lived in stone mansions on hills, while their workers died in wooden mills in the valley below. And when the mills finally closed in 1921, they left the workers with severance pay and no pensions, while the family retained wealth that still exists today. This isn't speculation. This isn't interpretation. This is what the records show. And nobody's talking about this because the DuPont family has carefully controlled their narrative for 2 centuries. Industrial death was normalized in the 19th century, so it seems less shocking to us now. The site is now a museum celebrating the family's success rather than commemorating worker deaths. Economic determinism contradicts American mythology about choice and opportunity. The family still has enormous wealth and influence. It's easier to celebrate innovation than mourn victims, and the dead can't speak for themselves. But here's the message that matters. Wealth built on exploitation doesn't become legitimate just because enough time passes. The DuPont empire is real. The innovation is real. The contributions to American industry are real. But so are the 350-plus dead workers, so are the widows and orphans left with nothing. So are the families who were economically coerced into accepting mortal danger as a condition of employment. You can't celebrate one without acknowledging the other. And if you visit Eleutherian Mills today, which you should, it's historically important, remember that the beautiful estate on the hill was built with profits from the death traps in the valley. Remember that every chandelier, every piece of imported furniture, every landscaped garden was paid for with the lives of men who had names we've forgotten. Remember that the water flowing peacefully in the Brandywine Creek once powered the machines that killed hundreds of people. Remember that this is how empires are built, not through innovation alone, not through hard work alone, not through entrepreneurial genius alone, through calculated decisions that value profit over human life, through economic systems that force people to choose between danger and starvation, through power imbalances so extreme that the wealthy can literally live on hills overlooking the deaths they're causing. That's the truth of Eleutherian Mills. That's the truth of American industrial history. That's the truth we need to remember. Because it's still happening today. Different industries, different companies, different specifics, but the same fundamental dynamic. Companies making profit from risk that workers bear. Until we fundamentally change that dynamic, until worker safety is valued as highly as shareholder returns, we're still operating on the same principles that killed 350 people at Eleutherian Mills. We've just gotten better at hiding the bodies, and nobody's talking about this because the powerful never want you to see how power's really built.